Great to see you all here today, and welcome all to the Pari Center's online summer series, exploring the life and work of David Bohm. For people who don't know me, I'm James G. Barbieri, member of Board of Directors here at the Pari Center, and I will be your host today. Today with me, we also have Eleanor Peet, who is the Program Director here at the Pari Center, and we have in the background Maureen Doolan, who is one of the co-founders of the Pari Center. They'll basically be in the background, ensuring that everything runs smoothly. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone of a couple of Zoom rules for this session. First of all, during the presentation, we ask participants to turn off their microphone to ensure better audio quality. For this reason, if we hear some background noise, we may mute you, but don't take this personally. It's just to ensure a better quality audio. If a participant would like to ask a question or make a contribution to the discussion, they can either use the raise your hand tool in Zoom, there should be near the chat section, or if they physically raise their hand, if I spot you, you can turn on your microphone. We also invite participants to turn on your video camera, as we believe that seeing everyone's faces, everyone's reaction creates a nice, inclusive education environment. But of course, if you don't feel comfortable with that, no problem, you're free to just keep it off. I do have to say that all sessions will be recorded for archival purposes. The recordings will not include possible breakout rooms, but they will include all the speakers' presentations, the Q&A, and the discussion. These recordings are available to anyone who has purchased a ticket for the session, or if a session that they've purchased but weren't able to attend, we will send you these videos. It should usually come up within the week of after the session. Today's session will be mainly a presentation from our speaker, Nichol, and then we'll have Q&A and discussion. And now I would like to introduce our speaker today, Nichol. Lee is the editor of David Bohm's On Dialogue, On Creativity, and the collection The Essential David Bohm. From 1980 to 92, Lee collaborated with Bohm on various aspects of dialogue, consciousness, and education. He has been on the faculty of the Oak Grove School in Ojai, California. Yesterday we saw Beth, who gave us a nice detailed introduction of David Bohm and dialogue, and today Lee will explore the topic of beyond dialogue. So I'm very excited for your talk. Over to you, Lee.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, I guess good evening too. Thank you, James. And let me just briefly thank everyone at the Pari Center. What an amazing summer program you guys have put together. Just really good. Also, Paul Howard, wow, what a great thing you have done with this film. It's really, in David's physics, Basil and others have carried that on quietly. It just keeps going. But in the public view, in the more general sense of Bohm's visibility, he was kind of slipping out of public view. Time was moving on. And you have utterly reversed that trend with your film. Bohm's visibility now is really extraordinary. And I think and hope that there will be a kind of renaissance in terms of interest in his work and carrying that work forward. So thank you, Paul. Really remarkable film and remarkable work. And I have to thank my wonderful wife, Eva Casey, who has helped me create some of the images that we'll be sharing today as we go through the talk. Now, as far as the talk is concerned, I'll probably go for about an hour and 10 minutes. That's what it's looking like at this point. And then we'll take a short break and we'll come back and have about 10 minutes more material to present. And then everything after that, we can do discussion, which I really look forward to. So let's jump in. Let's get going here. What we're looking at today is what might David Bohm have meant by the cosmic aspect of the human being. Now, to me, on its face, that in itself is interesting. But it's even more intriguing when we consider that in his vision of dialogue, he said that in the end, this cosmic aspect was really the aim of dialogue. It's very, very interesting to consider that. And what that does, of course, is if we take the cosmic aspect of the human as the kind of aim of dialogue in the long run, that enfolds the collective of the human being, and it enfolds the individual of the human being. So when we take that long view of the cosmic, we really have all aspects of the human being as he spoke of them, the individual, the collective, and the cosmic. It's all folded in there together. So let's get our first image up and see what we've got. Okay, this is a star field somewhere. I don't really know where it is. I think of this as the Carl Sagan view of the cosmos. I have a very soft spot for Carl Sagan. Those of us of a certain generation will probably remember him, not without some melodramatic performances, looking up into the stars. But the beautiful thing was, notwithstanding the criticisms that he's come in for, the beautiful thing was he did have us look up, and not just in the horizontal plane of all the human created world, but hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people were inspired to expand their view with Carl Sagan's cosmos. So this image is simply a representation of that. In this view, the cosmos are out there, up, out, they're out there and away from us. And we explore the cosmos, we look at it with telescopes, we go in spaceships to the moon, perhaps to Mars. It really is still in the kind of atomistic view that Bohm was trying to carry us beyond. And more power to Carl Sagan for that. No disparagement here. We're really using him as a kind of thrust block to move further into what Bohm was talking about. So in this view here, this pattern that we've added to the Sagan cosmos is really intended to suggest underlying orders, generative orders, implicate orders, out of which that three-dimensional star field is generated, out of which it is arising. So just an aside, this particular pattern is from one of David Bohm's book on creativity. It's from a gentleman named Ensor Holiday. And David was very taken with it as a way to illustrate some of his early thinking on the holo movement, or the holoflux, however you want to think about that. If you want to see the image in its original condition, you can look in that book and find it. But we're just using it now to give us a bit of an indication that in a Bohmian view, we don't just look at the surfaces. Obviously, we have to take into account the implicate order perspective. And let me say in that regard that today we'll be using the implicate order, that term, as an explanatory principle, not as a feature of mathematical physics, because I have no qualification in that regard at all. So, and this is what David did. He not only used it very technically, but he used it as an extensive explanatory principle in many, many different circumstances and cases. So that's what we're doing in this particular image, is drawing up a suggestion of implicate orders out of which the stars are emerging. Now, one other thing that we want to consider here is this question of the hollow movement, or the Holoflux. Bohm spoke of that phenomenon as the totality of everything. Tigers, galaxies, neutrinos, human thoughts and feelings, everything. Nothing is excluded from the Holoflux. And furthermore, he emphasized that all implicate orders arise out of that Holoflux. They're carried by it, I think is the term that he used. So as we go through what we'll be looking at today, we'll use these terms interchangeably: cosmos, totality, Holoflux, holomovement. Now, there's one piece about Holoflux and holomovement that's also worth noting. In the holomovement, if we just break that down a little bit, obviously it means movement. Everything is in movement. This was part of his worldview. Everything is in motion. So the Holoflux indicates that the whole, the totality, is in movement. But even more specifically, that every part of the totality contains the whole of the totality, and thus the holomovement. Now, the Holoflux was a term he toyed with at some point in the development of his thinking. I don't know how much it stuck, but nonetheless, his thinking on that, which he was explicit about, is that Holoflux is a different feeling, implies something different from holomovement. With holomovement, if you're not careful, you can have images of movement like an arrow moving from one place to another, or a river flowing from one place to another place. And he, of course, would not exclude those kind of movements from the holomovement, because everything is included. But he also indicated something more subtle than that kind of movement. So when he talked about Holoflux, he really meant transformations, that there would be changes from one state to another, and not just movement from one place to another. So there are a lot of nuances and shadings to all of this. And you can, I hope, just hold all of that and consider when we use any of these terms, they're really all kind of self-referencing and pointing to one another. Cosmos, totality, holomovement, Holoflux. Okay, let's get back to some of our images here. So one thing, even when we attempt like this, and obviously a two-dimensional image, to indicate implicate orders and the holomovement, it's very easy to slip into a kind of assumption that really all this is about material processes. And of course it is. Many shadings and different depths of material processes. But if we're going to work with the Bohmian cosmos, we can't limit what we're considering to just typical materialistic view. And so we give a little different shading to this pattern of the holo movement. It now has a blue cast, and that's to indicate consciousness. That any way you look at Bohm, any way you look at the holoflux, the holo movement, the totality, you cannot have matter separate from mind. You cannot have matter separate from consciousness. So this holo movement is like a sea of mind, matter, consciousness, meaning, constantly in flux and changing transformations. But we're still missing a critical piece here, and that is us. It's so important as we work with Bohm and his vision of the cosmos to remember that any time we step back and look at the cosmos in a somewhat so-called objective way, that stepping back, that's a very highly abstract move inwardly in our consciousness, that's stepping out. And we're going to look at that pretty closely as we go through. And his view, of course, was that in a more fundamental way, you never really can do that. We never really can step out. We're completely enmeshed as consciousness, as matter ourselves, as both. We're part of the unfolding, enfolding cosmos. We're living beings within the implicate order. So we can just hold on to all that and keep moving here. I love this image. I think of it as the old one. And what I mean by that is trying to get some more expanded feeling of the holo movement, of Bohm's cosmos. In one sense, it's all here in this image, the feeling of it, right? We're talking about an impressionistic view that we're going to work with, and nothing really technical. But the feeling of it, the living feeling, the depth of the ocean, you know, when you imagine down below in the depths of the ocean, that old, ancient feeling. And yet, as it comes up and sprouts out into the sunlight and into the air, it is completely, utterly new, constantly, every second, over and over, unfolding, enfolding, unfolding, enfolding. So that the kind of feeling for me of this holo movement is something profoundly ancient and perpetually new, both at the same time. And then even more nuance in that, it is, in Bohm's view, somehow timeless. So it's ancient, it's ever fresh, ever new, timeless, and also always living. So I'm going to refer to this totality from time to time in shorthand as the old one. If you hear that come up, you can maybe remember this wave and think of us as these tiny little bubbles, each one of us, a tiny little bubble, different places here in the wave. Okay, a few nuts and bolts. Many of you will have seen or read about the famous glycerin device. This is a device that I think David Bohm saw on a television program. And it was at the time that he was formulating this sense of the implicate order in his mind. And when he saw this device on television, he said, that's it. You know, in terms of an illustration, that's an excellent representation of what I'm trying to formulate. So just a brief review of how this works. This glycerin device has two cylinders, this inner cylinder and then the outer cylinder. And inside, filling it completely and invisibly, is glycerin, very thick and viscous glycerin. And I don't know the mathematical terminology or description, but there is a factor that when you start turning, which you would do with the handle, if you start turning this inner cylinder, then the glycerin closest to that inner cylinder starts turning with it. And slowly, the glycerin further out from the inner cylinder also starts turning. And then finally, the outermost glycerin that's up against the outer portion of the outer cylinder, that finally starts turning. So what these people did in this demonstration is they injected an ink drop onto the outer surface of the glycerin, and they started turning this crank. And at first, nothing happens. The ink drop just sits there. But as these rotations begin to pull all of the glycerin, even the glycerin closest to the surface, then this drop, this ink drop begins to get threaded out slowly. It gets thinner and thinner, thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. And although we don't have a moving video of it, you just have to envision that once it gets threaded thinly enough, it vanishes into the glycerin like there's nothing there. So then you start reversing the crank and you go the other way. And if you do it quickly enough, this threaded ink begins rapidly to reform, and suddenly, boom, you have the drop back. So when Bohm saw this demonstration, he thought, really, that's an excellent image of enfoldment and unfoldment, so that the glycerin is a kind of implicate order. Let's see, there was one more piece of this. Oh yeah, so if you put a number of drops in, you have this main one, but if you put 2 or 3 or 4 in at sort of different time points, and then you unspool everything like we were saying, if you do it fast enough, it actually, the ink drops will reappear so fast that it looks to be one drop that's moving. Surely somebody somewhere has created, you know, mechanical versions of this that can illustrate it very graphically. I hope so. If anybody knows of that, I would love to see such a demonstration. Okay, so there are a couple of very critical points for what we're going to go into today that come from this image of the glycerin device. Bohm said that it illustrates the conservative nature of matter. I think he also called it the recurrent nature of matter. We could use those terms interchangeably. Meaning by that matter has a tendency to stay the same. Obviously, it's not fixed ultimately because matter disintegrates, but it has a tendency to stay the same, like a rock remains a rock. There's an interesting story. about Bohm and a rock. There was a conversation between the Dalai Lama and David Bohm and Renee Weber, a philosopher from Rutgers, who was interviewing the two of them. And in the middle of the conversation, she said, "Is a rock conscious?" And the Dalai Lama said, "No." And David said, "Well," and he went on to say that in his view, that the rock has a kind of proto-consciousness, the potential for consciousness, because a rock stays a rock. Well, that's really quite remarkable to think about, honestly. A rock staying a rock. In a common sense view, of course it does. But it's such common sense that we don't ever really stop and think about how amazing it is that a rock stays a rock. And what Bohm was trying to point out in that conversation was there is some mind-like quality that informs the rock to keep its form in the way that it does. So then he carried that over to consciousness. He said the same thing about consciousness, that it has a propensity to be conservative, to be recurrent, to remain as it is. And again, it's a propensity, it's not anything ultimate. And we see that in us, in human beings, as the persistence of our identities. But some problems come in there when this persistence of identity seems to be too persistent in the way that Bohm would talk about it. It seems to get caught in a loop. And that's what we'll be looking at as we go on today. Okay, just one brief excursion off to the side here. In the glycerin device, I love this image. It's so effective and wonderful. But I've always felt that it's got to be more lively down in there in the implicate order than the glycerin device suggests. You know, there's got to be all kinds of incredible things happening in there, whatever they may be. So I ran across this image from a gentleman named Roger Burroughs. Now it's very interesting that Roger Burroughs and Ensor Holiday, who did the pattern that was in a previous slide a couple back that indicates the implicate order, that Burroughs and Holiday and Roger Penrose and a couple of other people did a book called Crystal Cave. And that book is full of these patterns. I highly recommend the book. They're all in black and white, and it's a coloring book. It's made for an adult coloring book, although of course children certainly could use it as well. But if you work with that book, and there's a whole series called the Altair Collection, if you work with that book, it does really strange things to your consciousness that make one more fertile toward somehow inwardly holding the implicate order. So just one more thing about this design from Burroughs. And both of these designs, of course, are Islamic. And this is a kind of modification, but the core of it is an Islamic design. And the same with Ensor Holiday's. But there is one interesting feature here. If you look over here to the left, Bohm talked about light rays intersecting, and that when light rays intersect, that's how matter is created. And then its form develops from that point forward. So just impressionistically, I enjoy thinking of these as convergent light rays. And then out of those rays, you start to get early form, and then more sophisticated form, and then even more sophisticated form, And then finally, we have the breakout into the explicate order. You could think of these as two of those ink drops. So for me, with David Bohm, I always try as much as I possibly can to have some kind of graphic image, some feeling quality, rather than just concepts. And for me, that's very helpful. So what we're going to do now is look at identity, at human identity, and how that relates to the implicate order. And we're going to use, in part, a very high-tech image. This is a basket, woven basket, I think, from Pakistan. And it's very simple, but for me, it has a very strong sense of both infolding and unfolding. And it's bounded in a clear way. So whenever we're using this going forward in the talk today and in the images that we use on the screen, when this comes up, it's something to do with human identity, and more specifically, the individual. What did Bohm mean by the individual? So this will be kind of a reference point. Whenever you see it, we're talking about a human being in some process of infolding or unfolding. Okay, let's see here. All right, so David went to great lengths at various points to talk about what he felt was the true individual. And he, as he often did, went to the etymology of words to open up what that could mean. And it's very simple and direct and clear. Individual means undivided. Individual means not divided. So what we're trying to get an impression of in this image that's on the screen now, remember we said anytime we see the basket, we're talking about some version of the human. So this would be, in a sense, that old one, again, that ancient quality of the totality of the Holo movement coming through the human being. An undivided human being would, by definition, be manifesting to some degree or another the entirety of the cosmos. Undivided, not divided, whole, total. So this notion of the undivided individual is something that Bohm came back to time and again. And it's a question that will be threaded through everything that we talk about today. So here, this image of the basket is obviously somewhat permeable and translucent, because it's allowing the entirety of the cosmos to pour through it. And one of our questions will be, can a human being do that? Are we capable of that kind of individuality? So here we come to a second kind of human individual, which again, Bohm talked about extensively, in contrast to the one we've just been looking at. This would be the contemporary individual, the individuality, the consciousness that all of us here today and everybody by and large throughout the world shares today. we could just simply call it modern consciousness. Now, Bohm, again, went to his etymologies and came up with idiosyncrasy. He determined that the best way to think of a modern individual, a modern human consciousness, is as an idiosyncratic process. So what did he mean by that? Well, the roots of the word mean private mixture, private mixture. So what's enfolded and unfolded here is not the entirety, the cosmos, the hollow movement that we were looking at in the previous individual, but it's the social values, the consciousness of the world as it is. That all of those thoughts and all of those feelings and all of those meanings are the ones that get enfolded idiosyncratically, privately into contemporary individual. So it's very interesting that that notion of the private, which is separated from the whole, at least in the United States, and I think in many other nations in the world, it's enshrined legally in our constitutions, in the entire framework of the society, that this private individual, this private mixture is given great protection and is held as a very high ideal. So it's very strong in our cultures, this idiosyncratic individual. And that one, it's curious, we should probably say at the outset, somehow, in some way, there's no way that that one could not have enfolded into it also the whole, the totality, even though the predominant enfoldments are the society's values and thoughts. Somewhere way down in there, the hollow movement has to be present by definition. It cannot not be there because this individual, this idiosyncratic modern individual, lives within the holoflux, because the holoflux is all that is. Okay, so now we have these two. We have these two. And what are we going to do with this? What happens when we hold these two together? We have the true individual, the undivided individual, and then we have the atomistic, modern, idiosyncratic individual that by definition is separated from each other individual. So what are we going to do with that? From a Bohmian perspective, how does that work? Well, this is where we have to consider a key factor in all of this. And that is the nature of thought, the presence of human thought. Everything in Bohm hinges on the presence of human thought. And that thought is tricky, tricky, tricky. And that's why we have our friend here, trickster, the joker, the harlequin. It's very interesting when you consider some of the definitions of harlequin. A wily and unscrupulous servant. A wily and unscrupulous servant. So that's how we're going to think of thought, as a wily and unscrupulous servant. We think it's our servant, but there's much going on with thought that's not as it appears. Okay, let's get back here. So here we have the two individuals. We have the permeable individual, undivided, open to the hollow movement, manifesting the hollow movement potentially. And then we have our modern human individual. And that one I want to propose, and Bohm discussed this at length in different terms. That one, that modern one, is eclipsing the old one. The ancient one, the ever new one, is being eclipsed by the modern one. We're forgetting that this true individual even exists. It's beginning to fade from our collective knowledge, collective wisdom, collective understanding. And this atomistic individual is right on the verge of completely eclipsing that old true individual. And unlike the movement of the planets, when this eclipse becomes total, it doesn't keep moving and then the one behind it comes out again. It will just be gone. So thought, human thought, is central to this eclipse process. And that's why we have our little guy, the harlequin, up here in the corner. Whenever you see him, thought is at work. Thought is afoot and playing some tricks. Okay. So we'll look a little bit at thought, and we'll look a little bit at thinking, and we'll look a little bit at thoughting, and a little bit at feeling and felt and feeling, felting. Sorry, I get a little tongue-tied with some of this. So we're going to cover thought a bit, but thought is very complex in Bohm's worldview, and we'll only be able to look at a certain amount of that. But thought is very much like this icosahedron, right? 20 faces, I think. You can really go deeply into one face, and then you can go to a different face and a totally different facet of thought. And then they even interpenetrate and come from within, intermixing the different facets of thought. So I'm hoping that my old friend David Moody will have covered thought pretty thoroughly in a previous presentation with his characteristic clarity and eloquence. So on that assumption, I'm going to move ahead with our limited survey of thought. Okay, so, oh, excuse me, I think I've made a mistake here. Right. I'm not so good with all this technology. My wife, Eva, has really made it possible. Okay. So we have these 6 terms here: thinking, thought, thoughting, feeling, felt, felting. And we have our image here, which is meant to indicate, for instance, if we just take thinking and feeling as a pair, they cannot be separated if we're to understand David Bohm. They cannot be separated. They're perpetually flowing into and moving into one another. Perpetual transformation of thinking and feeling into one another. So let's look at these terms briefly. Bohm held out the prospect that thinking and feeling were really quite alive in terms of their effect in the world. Excuse me, just one moment. And that at times and in certain circumstances, that thinking and feeling could actually draw directly from implicate orders, from the Holo movement. For instance, in profound artistic creations or extraordinary breakthroughs in scientific thinking. The thinking and feeling aspects there, Bohm felt were truly creative. And came from quite deep orders of consciousness. But from his view, that's very rare in human experience, very, very rare. What we end up with is the husk of thinking, which is thought, right? We're thinking, it's present tense, and then when that thinking is past, it becomes thought. And the same with feeling. The feeling is present and alive, and when that passes, it becomes felt. So then we have thought and we have felt. And Bohm opened this up at great length in a very beautiful way, but I think for now the simple version is all that we need. And that all those thoughts and all those felts accumulate all through human history into a kind of pool of inert husks, of inert thought and felt that once might have been thinking and feeling. But it's all past now, and it's all pooled, it's all accumulated and collected. So I took these terms, thinking, thought, feeling, felt, that Bohm used, and I took it one step further. Thought and then thoughting. Because Bohm said this pool of thought that's collected through history is really not inert, that it's active, and that's where the heart of our problems lie. That thought pretends that it's doing nothing other than reporting on the world, but it's really active, that it is constantly presenting itself as making things occur, not presenting itself as itself making things occur, but it's constantly presenting a world that just seems to be there as it is. And the same with felting, right? So we have thoughting and felting tricking us, acting as though the world is being presented as it is, the true world, when in fact it's old thoughting and old felting very actively and slyly and through wile presenting the world to us as though we're seeing it as it is. So we have our trickster here again. And we have this in red because this is really, from a Bohmian perspective, this is the danger zone. This is where things get critical. This is where many things start to go wrong in human experience. So let's see. Here we go. Okay, so we'll just look at this a little bit more to emphasize strongly that we don't see this happening generally. We don't see that our daily moving around in the world is functioning through thoughting and felting. We just think we're taking it all in, and it's like how we see it. It's what it is. But it's heavily, heavily, heavily filtered and constructed through thoughting and felting. So the key thing with this is that this closed circuit, and if you note, this is not permeable like the previous image. Let's go back briefly. Yeah. See, this is permeable because we have thinking here. It can let new things in. Here, once we get into thoughting and felting, it's pretty tightly closed. And even more significantly, this thoughting and felting becomes our default. It becomes the basic mode. Even if we pop out of it momentarily, we go right back into this thoughting and felting. Okay, so we're moving now into a segment that we'll call Thought as a System, which of course is the name of one of David's books. And if you want to get a fuller picture of the things that we're talking about today, there's no better place to go than that book, Thought as a System. Excuse me one moment. I'm having lots of frogs in my throat. Okay, so this is really important to try to get a clear picture of this way of thinking about thought as a system. There are many ways that we can approach it, but here, all these spheres, these nested spheres, are indicating the compressed environment, the enclosing, enveloping environment that every human being lives within. So just in a very quick way of thinking about it, we could say that that enveloping environment begins with thought and language and kind of invisibly develops and changes the world that the human being lives in. And this human being, by the way, is, as many people may know, Botticelli's Venus. So we're not using her here in her goddess form. She's just one of us today. So we begin in this enveloping environment with language and thought. And then we have early tools, development of those tools, which comes from language and thought. A huge one of those, of course, is fire, but then hand axes, spears, the earliest of the tools. And those begin to change. And we have a new enveloping environment as a result of early tool use. And that environment becomes somewhat visible, unlike the invisible environment of language and thought. And then there's another big jump in which we begin to function in collectives, villages, cities, towns. And the tool development by then, of course, has taken many, many steps forward, much more sophisticated and thoroughgoing. But there's a very important part of this thought as a system view once we get to this collective aspect. And that is Bohm's definition of thought. So in that view, thought is not just in our heads. It's not just here. It's in the environment that we've built. It is the environment that we've built. He put a very unique spin on that built environment, on all of human artifacts. And in fact, anything really touched or modified or influenced by humans. So that if you're driving in a car on a freeway in a city, everything that you're looking at, the concrete on the road, the car that you're in, the buildings, all of it in Bohm's definition is thought, because it's a contiguous, unbroken movement from the inception within our minds to its expression out into the world. And it's a little bit of a leap to get yourself used to thinking about a hospital or a post office or a car as being thought. But if you can sort of play around with that and get that notion settled inside of yourself, it's a huge step in understanding what Bohm was really trying to convey about how deeply extensive thought is. Okay, so back to our spheres. And this is where that shows up most strongly, that all of us at any point can step out and look. Everything in the house that you're in, or all that for Bohm is thought. So as time moves on, so to speak, a next huge development of enveloping our consciousness is electricity, because we have indoor lighting, we have telephones, telegraphs, televisions, and just stop and think, even very briefly, about how massive this change was in terms of the lived environment of human beings. It's a huge, huge shift in that enclosure of thought. Again, with each human being right at the center of all this. And then the next step, the most recent one, is our black mirrors, which is a term for our computers, our cell phones, our tablets, TVs, watches. I just saw something this morning. They're back at it again now with the glasses, right? One of the companies, I think Amazon, even though Apple completely failed, I think it was Apple or someone completely failed in trying to bring out computerized glasses, now Amazon is at it. So we'll see what happens there. But like at the step of electricity, you don't have to think very much at all to consider how massively we've been affected by the tablet device culture in 20 different ways. It's so clear. All you have to do is walk down the street, and how many people are like this, right? And I'm not commenting on that in a particularly negative way. The main thing is to realize how pervasive our interaction and engagement with these black mirrors has become. It's almost total. So all of these spheres of development, they obviously interpenetrate. Each one enfolds the previous one, and all of this is bearing down on us. It's the environment that we live in, and it's a little bit like, you know, putting the frog, poor frog, into the water and very slowly heating it up until, you know, the frog is not noticing because it's gradual, and then at some point the water's boiling and the frog is dead. This is not unlike that in terms of the gradual accumulation and compression in our consciousness of all of these many factors. And the last one that I'll mention, I think as of today, there are something like 5,000 communication satellites orbiting the Earth. But within the next couple or 3 years, there are another 5,000 to 10,000 slated to go up. And these are just the ones from Elon Musk. These are just the ones from his company, SpaceX. I don't know how many more beyond that are slated from other companies. But when we take the 10-year view from Elon Musk, we have 50,000 satellites slated for orbit around the United States. I'm sorry. There's my national centrism coming into play, obviously, around the world. So our trickster here, gosh, what can you say? You know, all of this is bearing down on our consciousness, defining our consciousness, and it's something that we just become acclimated to. And that, I think, is really a very significant problem. So we're now with our Venus. And unfortunately, if we go back to this slide, this is not the end of the story. There are further complicating factors, and that's what we're looking at here. Somewhere in the development of human consciousness, we have this emergence of a second person within ourselves. I mean, you can describe it in so many ways. I don't want to get technical about this. I'm not a specialist. I just know that I have this. There's I and me. There's two of us. They talk to one another. One sometimes talks to the other unbidden and unwanted, chattering and saying this and saying that. This is the observer and the observed. One version, just like with thought, there are many, many variations and nuances with the observer and the observed. But this is one that's really important for what we're doing today. And this is one that every one of us shares. I don't know that I've ever met anyone that doesn't have some version of this double interior experience. Me and myself, I and me. It's just a given. It's what we have. So in many respects, that development is potentially a good thing. It may allow us to mirror ourselves back to ourselves, to understand things about ourselves, you know, sort of by standing back and looking back at ourselves. We can learn certain things. So at the very least, it could be valuable in that way. But what's happened in Bohm's description of it is this image. Let's say this is the quote unquote, the real original human. And then there's an image that real human has. And that image takes on ultimate value. One's self-image takes on the highest value. And that brings up questions of how Bohm used the term necessity, which we won't go into, except to say that when you attribute the highest value to something, it becomes necessary to take care of it, to sustain it, to protect it. So once we have this self-image, that's the game that we're in, is protecting that self-image at all costs. So once again, our harlequin trickster friend, our wily servant, is at work here. So yet again, it compounds even more. What we have here is just a fusion of the observer and the observed, the self-image and the self, with thoughting and thinking. You know, this is very kind of complex if you want to slow down and take it to pieces, which we're not going to do, but you don't really have to do that to get a clear, intuitive feeling that our old thoughting and our old feltings are really the factors that bind us to this self-image. All of these things are mutually self-reinforcing. The thoughting, felting, me and myself, it's all tied together in that way. And it's tied together pretty tightly. Maybe in the discussion we can can look at some of that. But in Bohm's perspective, something has started to go really wrong once this becomes ubiquitous. And from that perspective, it is ubiquitous. It's universal at this point. There would be very, very few pockets left in the world. And there are a few perhaps, but very few, where everyone is not participating in this fusion of the observer and the observed and thoughting and felting. It's everywhere. We all have this. We all share this. We all participate in this together, and yet it's invisible unless we pay attention to it. So one other last piece of this, poor Venus, she's coming in for a hard time here. With the device culture and all the black mirrors, in one sense, you could claim that that's an expansion of consciousness, right? So that Venus's image is now, it can be anywhere, all the time, all over the place. So this huge expansion of the self-image. But really, I don't think so. This is, I think, a tremendous contraction of consciousness. It's a fragmentation. It's taking this split of the observer and the observed and amplifying it many times over. And then this becomes, especially with, you know, new generations coming in that are just born into this with social media and so on and so forth, this becomes the norm. So that trying to unravel or work your way back through how all of this is put together becomes enormously complicated and more difficult as a result of this fragmentation by way of device culture. Okay, so let's just do a brief summary here. We have the modern individual eclipsing the old true individual. We have thoughting and felting as a closed system as our default consciousness. We have a massive set of nested spheres, metaphorically, functioning as enclosing environments, enveloping environments in our consciousness, all of them enfolded into each and every one of us. We have the fragmentation of the observer and the observed and the fusion of that with thoughting and felting. And we have the utter ubiquity of that phenomenon throughout the developed world, throughout the modern world, developed or not. It becomes the sea that we all swim in. And then we have all that amplified by the fragmentation of the black mirrors of the device culture. So all of this is an accumulation. It's an accumulated constriction of human consciousness. So then what do we do with all of that? Well, I think we come to this. This is us. This is humanity. And we can think of this as a kind of merry-go-round. If you just envision this perpetually turning in a circle, around and around and around, we have some quietness, we have some happiness, and we have some real difficulties. We have all of them looping around and around. We could call it the human the human merry-go-round. So Bohm talked about this suffering aspect, this confusion, this conflict, the pain, the isolation. Talked about that a great deal. So we're going to have a pretty close look at that. But, you know, this is an old story. It's not new. It's not something that Bohm was the first to observe. We find it in both East and West historically. Here, of course, is a Tibetan wheel of karma, and very sophisticated, very nuanced and detailed how they break down this process that Bohm has, in a sense, recapitulated without really any reference to these historical versions. And this is a Fortune's wheel, the wheel of fortune. I think Boethius was the first to circulate this idea in one of his writings. But we see both in West and East what we're calling for now the merry-go-round, the human merry-go-round. So this is a kind of default, you know, this part of the mask of the human merry-go-round. And when we talk about this part of it, it's easy to somehow form a mistaken picture. What I want to say, echoing Bohm, is that this feature, this confusion and uncertainty and sorrow, is kind of like a default in human experience. Now, that doesn't mean that we go through, any given one of us, that we go through our day miserable or deeply unhappy, or no, we often go through many, many days happy and doing creative and good things and enjoying the company of our friends and fellows and companions. To hold the possibility that the fragmentation and the sorrow and the confusion is fundamental doesn't mean that we don't have these other qualities in our life. We most certainly and obviously do. But it does suggest that we're somehow stuck and have been for millennia in this kind of state, an underlying state of fragmentation, confusion, division, sorrow. So if we come back to the merry-go-round and we think, well, is there a way off of this? Is there a way out of this? Is there anything that we can do? What do we do with it? How do we work with this? That becomes the question. And of course, David Bohm had a great deal to say about what do we do with this? Is there anything that we can do? So one thing to consider is, do we have in us, and this is me, this is not necessarily Bohm, do we have, even in the midst of that merry-go-round, do we have some vague recollection of something different? Do we have some vague intimation of wholeness? Right. A vague intimation of a feeling of total participation in a living cosmos. A memory, vague, an intimation, We could talk about it in 100 different ways. But is there some thread, even in our fragmented merry-go-round consciousness, that is deriving up out of the deeper implicate order of consciousness and hinting to us that there is a possibility of transformation in the human corner of the Holoflux? This is a real possibility in what we want to look at. Okay, so just when we talk about that possibility, just to go back briefly to this enfoldment and unfoldment, and one way that I envision this is that now this is us here in this image. We had them as the ink drops before, but now this is our consciousness, let's say, an aspect of our consciousness. And I'm just proposing, as Bohm did, that somewhere deep in the implicate order of consciousness, something through God knows how many complex and strange combinations and permutations finds its way into our open explicate consciousness. That kind of hint or intimation or vague memory of wholeness, of being related to the whole. Okay, so we're coming into the final part of the talk before we take a break. But this is really the core of what we want to do here. This is really the heart of thinking this through about the holo movement and the cosmos and the human being. This is a painting from Salvador Dali. It's of his wife, Gala. I'm not sure when this was done. I think in the 60s or early 70s, but I'm not sure. In any event, we're going to take this painting and twist it completely to our purposes today. Some of that may overlap with what Dali himself was intending to intimate in the painting. I have no idea, but we're going to make it ours for today. So the first thing to note here is these fragments of Gala's physicality and her consciousness, they're moving in an orderly pattern. And it's a somewhat spiral and unspiral pattern, very similar to the feeling of enfoldment and unfoldment in the glycerin device. So that's the first thing, just to kind of get the feeling of the movement, this enfolding, unfolding movement of Gala. And the next way we want to think of it is that this is really primarily her consciousness unfolding, her consciousness unspooling, that all of these fragments are the contents of Gala's consciousness. And that consciousness is unspooling. It's kind of unraveling, and yet it's orderly. It's not a chaotic unfolding. It's not a chaotic unraveling. There is an order to it. And another thing we'll bring in, again, just for our purposes today, is to suggest that this unraveling, unfolding, unspooling of the contents of Gala's consciousness, all of that is intentional. That Gala herself is participating in this unfolding. Now, this gets into some very interesting issues about how a human being goes about this type of transformation. David's friend, Owen Barfield, spoke about this at great length, wrote about this at great length about the intention involved in this kind of transformation. I think in his book, Saving the Appearances, you get the most succinct and potent version of that. Well worth seeking out and be prepared to be really challenged by Owen Barfield. But without elaborating on that further, we're just saying that for today and our visioning of this, that this unspooling of Gala's consciousness is in part her intention, that she's engaged in bringing about certain conditions that allow this to happen. Now, what might those be? Well, you could go into a lot of different things that Gala might have done to participate in allowing this unspooling to occur. We may come back to that also in the discussion. So the next thing we want to point out here is that there is no observer and observed. Within, there is no observer. And why is that? That is because both the observer and the observed are the contents of Gala's consciousness. And when they're unraveling, there is no other observer in there observing it. There is no interior entity looking at the unraveling. There's no thinking. There's no thought. There's no thoughting. And yet, there is a vividly awake silence. A vividly awake silence. No thinking, no thought, no thoughting. And yet, the presence of a vividly awake, alive silence. And I would propose in this imaging, this way of working with it, that really that silence is coming greatly from the depths of the implicate order in Bohm's modeling of it, greatly from the depths of the Holoflux, and allowing this transformation of Gala's consciousness. So a couple of more pieces of this before we take a break. I think this is how dialogue really works. That you need this unspooling, this unfolding, this knowing unraveling of your consciousness to occur for dialogue to really happen. Now, if you have 20 people, would everyone need to be doing this? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it really becomes a question of a critical mass, of having a critical mass. And if you have 20 people or 25 people, it may be only 3 people, 4 people that are at some level, in some way, to some degree, engaged with this unspooling of one's consciousness. And when you have this with a few people, then that those contents of your consciousness begin to interpenetrate the contents of the consciousness of the other people that are in the dialogue. It's an extraordinary thing, really. But it's very challenging just to release one's consciousness and allow it to unfold, to unspool. And then to do that with a group of other people is even more challenging, at least in my experience, but it's exhilarating and extraordinary and incredibly powerful. And it does happen. It's possible for this to happen. I've seen it. I'm sure some people watching today have seen this, participated in it. It's a very real thing and extremely powerful. So this, I think, helps us understand the real depth of what Bohm was getting at with the vision of dialogue. So this is our last piece before the break. Here again, we have Gala, and she's at the center where we had Venus before, and we have all of these enveloping, compressing environments of consciousness. But Gala is changing that. By this liberation of her consciousness, by releasing the contents of her consciousness, she is also transforming the entire collective thought as a system, weakening that in some form, in some way, allowing the original individual to begin to shine through, allowing the old one, allowing the perpetually new one to begin to shine through again. And then if you take this back into the dialogue version, you get not just, I think, arithmetical effect, but probably exponential effect if you have multiple people participating in this shared unspooling of consciousness. So thank you for your patience as we've gone through all of this. Let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back and I'll finish what I have to share with you. And then the rest of the time we'll have a discussion. So 5-minute break, we'll be back at 35 after the hour.
If now we've got these 5 minutes, if anyone would like to say something after that, just between ourselves, everyone's felt welcome to.
Yesterday I was thinking of cubism, because the multiple perspectives of cubism, and someone had mentioned Gertrude Stein's, I guess it was a portrait of Picasso, where she, has anyone read that poem by Gertrude Stein? Where the language is repetitive, and it's like, just the way that she wrote that poem is so it's like the literary version of a Cubist painting, where all these sentence fragments are kind of like repeated and repeated, and they change a little bit each time. So it's very much like that image of Salvador Dali that we look at, or a Cubist painting. And I was trying to yesterday I was thinking to myself, well, how was Cubism kind of influenced? I mean, I studied art history, but that was so many years ago that I kind of forget that. But I'm curious about the influences of in Cubism. Does anybody know about that?
Yeah. Sorry.
Sure, go ahead, Peter.
I just wanted to mention, perhaps for, sorry, I can't remember his name, the person who spoke there. A very, very interesting book is the first book by Leonard Schlein called Art and Physics. And Leonard Schlein's hypothesis, he was a brain surgeon, actually died of a brain tumor. But the first book he wrote hypothesized that art preceded the theories of physics. And there's, I think, quite a bit about cubism and whatnot, and the parallel to the way physics and perhaps quantum mechanics was developed. It's well worth investigating. Well, he only wrote 4 books. Leonard Schlein, Art and Physics.
Could you type the name into the chat?
Sorry?
Could you type the name into the chat?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
I'll put it on everybody. Leonard Schlein. Yeah. All of his books are very interesting, but regarding what you referred to, cubism and everything, his first books, Art and Physics, are probably the most interesting in that respect.
And Ferdinand, just to answer your question, here at the Pari Center, we actually did have a session. It was a free one. It was a session called Art, Science, and David Bohm. And we have it recorded and it's on YouTube at the moment. I'll just send the link at the moment. And we had presentations by myself, Sky, who I think is in our audience here, and Peter Jacobs as well. So if you're interested in art and science and David Bohm, I recommend that.
Okay.
I can see Jean has her hand up just to finish this break.
Yeah, just wanted to say something to Peter. I have both those books because you gave them to me in 2017, actually. They were your copies. I'm not quite sure why you gave them to me, but you said you had others at home. The other thing I wanted to say was that in an earlier conference, we heard I think it's participatory thought sees that everything partakes of everything. So Lee has raised a number of images, and I must admit, what I've been kept going back to in my mind is sound and music. Now, music is part of my very earliest memories, and something that I resonate to. I am a very amateur musician, but I had a dream when I was 18 years old, and I played the entire Brahms Second Piano Concerto in this dream. Now, I certainly do not know how to play that concerto. And then later, I did experimentation. I'm the generation of the 60s that did some participatory experimentation with LSD. And I can remember a synesthesia experience where I heard Brahms' Third Symphony coming out of my left arm. Okay, so this is a very psychotic sort of image, but it was very interesting. And the other experiment that I did took me to the edge of the cosmos. And it was such an extraordinary experience that when it was over, I said, I never need to do it again. I've been there, and this will last me for my lifetime. And now at a certain age, I've been fascinated by physics and came to Paris. And now I just want to tell you a funny little anecdote that concerns you, James, and your mother, Eleanor. There's a fellow in our group who is very disruptive, and we later gently had to tell him he needs to leave. And your David Pete, your grandfather, would never have come to that decision himself, but this fellow interrupted the morning lectures so much, even though we had a contract that we would listen and have questions in the afternoon. So I'm walking down from this conference, and there is your mother sitting at the cafe. I've not met her before, and she's got this flowing, beautiful hair, and you're sitting in her lap, a little blonde-haired child of about 3 years old. And I turned to Kathy Rogie and I says, there it is, Venus. And Kathy says, yeah. And behind me is this disruptive guy who says, yeah, like that. And I said, whoops, Kathy, we better go rescue Eleanor. So he was fascinated by this and immediately saw Eleanor as the incarnation of this Venus. But she did look very much like that. Yeah. Your mom is very beautiful.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Valji.
Yes,
we will have room for discussion soon, but I can see Lee is back with us, so we'll let him finish his presentation.
Sure, I'll mute.
Go ahead, Lee.
Am I unmuted now? Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I'm so sorry. I apologize for going on so much longer than I had intended. You know, you try to do a rough practice run and you think it's going to take a certain amount of time, and then I went way over. I'm really sorry about that. So I'm going to truncate the last bit here. I'll go through it more quickly than I had intended so that we can get on to some discussion. But I think 3 points that I would want to make in this last bit. The one is, if he said it once, he said it 100 times, David Bohm, that these modelings, the implicate order model, the holo movement, these are all descriptive terms, they're explanatory principles, and they're maps. And perhaps it may turn out, even from a physics point of view, very accurate maps. We're hoping so. They feel accurate if you work with them inwardly and outwardly. But they're maps nonetheless. And he was very emphatic that at some point you have to leave the maps. You know, if you want to engage in the depths of the things that he was talking about, even all these lovely descriptions, you have to leave them aside. You have to go it alone. You have to enter the territory that David Bohm entered to come up with those terms, right? That's so important, and it's so easy to lose sight of that. Otherwise, we become secondhand human beings, and we're really operating through concepts and ideas, and not in the holo movement. So if the holo movement is an accurate map, then it's a map of something living, and entering that knowingly, I think that's what this is all about. I think that's what David worked so hard to get us to consider. So in line with that, I think we have to experiment ourselves. If we want to really enter that territory, we have to take risks, real risks. And if you take risks, you may make mistakes. If you're too careful working into and through all of these things we've been talking about, I don't think you'll get very far, because that's the conditioning at work again, which is not to say it doesn't require discipline, but there has to be some kind of balance between discipline and a liberating quality where you're willing to go so far that you might make a mistake. You might have a misconception of something. Well, who cares? Do it. And then correct it. find out if you made a mistake, correct it, and get on a new track, you know, a new level of assimilation of what you're doing. So that I just wanted to emphasize that that's really important, not to get stuck in anybody's model when you're working in this territory. So in that vein, just a couple of last images I would like to share with you, some experiments that I've been running for a couple of months. I like to think of it as liberating the explicate order, because if we can do that, which really means liberating our consciousness, like the Gala consciousness of letting it unfold further than we're used to having it. If we allow that to happen, all kinds of possibilities open up. So I've been running some experiments, and I just want to share one with you, and then we'll go to our discussion. So it begins with the body, with the human body. And there are three images here. The one in the center is the cardiovascular system, the flowing of blood. The one on the left is the lymph system, plasma flowing. The one on the right is the nervous system, electricity flowing through the body. All of these are energetic processes flowing through the body. And I just started asking myself, what would it be like to unfreeze the way that I experience the world, to have the world that I'm living in right now today appear more like what one feels the holo movement, the holoflux might actually be like? What would it take? Is there an experiment that might give some data about that, some real lived information about that? And I thought, okay, if I'm going to do that, it's got to start very close to home. And that is inside the body, with this flowing of the blood, flowing of electricity, the life forces that are flowing through the body. So I began to tune into that and pay a great deal of attention to it, and just getting some feeling for an ongoing awareness. It's really very easy to do this. You can do it right this second. If you pay attention to your forearm, even lightly, you can feel the energy in your arm. It's patently obvious. So to keep the terminology simple, I just think of this as blood, the flowing of blood. But of course, it's really the flowing of the electricity, the flowing of the blood, all of these flowing elements. This is what we can easily sense in our body. So then I decided, okay, I need, let's see, I've clicked the wrong button here. If I have trouble getting back, it'll be okay. I need to get to, okay, sorry. So I'm sensing very close, closer than close, the body, the flowing energy in the body. And then I thought, I need something far away. And in that particular moment, I was able to see beautiful clouds outside of my window. So that's what I picked, were the clouds. And these clouds are moving at a kind of stately pace. And I'm really waking up to those clouds. And at the same time, I'm sensing the flowing movements in my body. So it's different. 1 and 1 is not 2 when you do that. 1 and 1 is more like 10. There is, at least in my experience, there's a vast space that opens up when you're grounded and paying attention to the living processes in your body, And then you open your awareness to this also flowing, moving, explicate phenomenon, in this case, the clouds. Not, I mean, just to give a very crude image, that looks a little bit like this. But I also tried doing this with the sun. One way you can do it, this is much harder than with the clouds, is to notice if you're indoors, you're sensing the flow of the energy in your body. And then you notice the shifting in ambient light in your house. If you're, I mean, a lot of us are indoors a lot these days, so it's an opportunity. And it's not easy to keep steady track throughout the day of the ambient light in your house. You can do it, but it's not so easy. The clouds are much easier to do. You can also do this at night, of course, with the stars. But the one that is easiest and in some ways really, in my experience, very effective is the flowing movements within your body. And then you create this distance and space by also paying attention to the movement of clouds. It opens something up. That's all I'll say at this point. But it's a worthwhile experiment. And something in me fantasizes about having, 20 or 30 people running these kinds of experiments and comparing notes. Can we liberate the explicate order and find a way to live in it that's more true to the depth of the hollow movement, because we begin to perceive the explicate order as a reflection of that living, moving, undivided, flowing wholeness. Okay, James, I'm going to stop there. We can take the rest of the time for discussion, however you want to set that up.
Okay, fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Lee, for that presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I loved your use of your props, your masks. I loved how you used it. So yeah, I mean, I'll just open it up to questions. I can see Gary already has his hand up. Is that right?
This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. You talked a lot about thought, and you differentiated it from affectivity. And I have a sense that affectivity is also a way to access the implicate order and to get down into the intuitive. To get back to what Valjean was saying earlier, I think music is a key. Music, we know, activates the right hemisphere. And actually recent work has shown that the melody of music is clearly accessed through right hemispheric activity, whereas the lyrics are accessed through left hemispheric activity. And the affective component, I think, is associated with the music. I'm just wondering whether, that sense of emotional connection that brings us together, that, the sense of compassion, the sense of empathy for the other, that opens us up, maybe another way. I mean, it's certainly a practice within some of the world's faith traditions. The power of love, the power of compassion to bring us closer together and to allow us to, begin to solve our problems together and to communicate more effectively with each other.
Yes, well, the short version, from my perspective, would be absolutely 100%. The affective is there. And I perhaps did a poor job of indicating when we were talking about thinking and feeling and thought and felt. I would include the affective in that feeling part of it, and was hoping to convey that thinking and feeling are contiguous, unbroken, all of a piece, and never divisible from one another. So if we brought affect into that, I mean, quite frankly, it's very hard for me personally to imagine how you could do this work and go deeper into it without the affective being, you know, turned on 10.
Right.
Yeah, surely.
Thank you, Gary, for asking that question. I see Layli has her hand up.
Thank you, and thank you, Lee. That was so interesting. I really, really enjoyed your presentation. I have a couple of questions I would like to ask regarding the terminology, some words that you use. One was when you did the juxtaposition of the images, you talked about the old one and the modern human being. And my question is that something that only applies in modern times, or is that just a condition of being human? And the second question was, in your diagram, you used the term black mirrors to refer to technology. And I was, that really caught me, and I was curious where that term comes from.
Yes. Let me see. With regard to the first question, could you just repeat that once again, please?
Yes, the juxtaposition of the modern person and the old one.
Right.
Does that, is it a distinction between modern times, or is that a condition of just being a human being?
Yes, thank you. I should be really clear on this point that the term, the old one, that's my term, because that's part of how I feel that quality. It's not a David Bohm term, although he did talk about it, you know, so the old one is both the oldest of the old and the newest of the new. That's what I was hoping to convey there. It is a human being, undivided individual, in which the cosmos is actually flowing to some extent through that person, the ancientness of the cosmos and the ever freshness of that. The distinction that I was hoping to draw there is the modern consciousness is not the same as that old one. The modern consciousness is, at least from certain perspectives, an evolution in human consciousness. This is the way, of course, that Owen Barfield talks about it. Excuse me. And what I was trying to convey is the distinction that the modern consciousness is enfolding information primarily from the human-made, thought-based environment, and that it is in fact constituted. That's what Bohm meant by the idiosyncratic individual, that the components of the thought-based human culture come together in each one of us in slightly different ways, and that constitutes each one of us as a modern human being. And that constriction, that tightening over time of that consciousness, that enfolding is a different enfolding from the undivided individual that's perpetually enfolding and unfolding the entire cosmos to some degree or other. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. That does clarify it, so that the modern does relate to like human-made, being in a human-made environment, and it is constricting, covering.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then the dark mirrors or black mirrors?
Yes, I love the term. There was some television series I think it was called Black Mirror. It's the, the first time I'd ever heard that term. And it's a series of these remarkable and sometimes very unsettling and frightening warnings about what happens when we become immersed in device culture. So that's the short version of Black Mirror. But since you opened that question, I can't help but bring in one other piece of it. Living here in New Mexico, you know, this is in many respects, it's Mexico. Even though it's politically part of the United States, there's so much of the psychic power of old Mexico that washes into us up here. And there is a very large and complicated mythic structure around two Nahuatl beings. One is called Quetzalcoatl, which many people are familiar with. But Quetzalcoatl's nemesis in many of these tellings is called Tezcatlipoca. So Tezcatlipoca translates into obsidian mirror, black mirror. And it's a very strange and ungainly image when you see some of the paintings that originally depicted this being Tezcatlipoca. One of his feet is a round obsidian mirror. And in some of the tellings of the stories, his function was to create chaos. And it was through this smoking obsidian mirror that he injected chaos into the culture. And now we've got obsidian mirrors by the millions, right? We have this mythic figure of Tezcatlipoca, which you could also think of as the trickster of thought, plying his wares hither and thither. So anyhow, I hope I've answered that question.
Thank you so much. Yes, that's very helpful.
Thank you, Layli. I believe Mel has had her hand up for a while now.
Thanks. I just want to share that in Waldorf education or in Steiner anthroposophic Waldorf education, we have an emphasis of thinking, feeling, and willing, which we have to consciously integrate into our teaching methods. So I wonder if there's also the aspect of willing, the head, heart, and hand. If that also comes into the discussion aside from thought and feeling and felt. Yes.
Well, first of all, I think that the model that you work with is quite extraordinary. Rudolf Steiner had so much to say about what he called, what was it, living thinking. And for people that are interested in Krishnamurti, it seems to go off in the opposite direction. I think, in fact, it does not do that. And there's a lot to learn from Steiner's notion of living thinking. But the willing part, this is what I was beginning to touch on when we had the image of Gala and Gala's unspooling consciousness. One of the things that I mentioned was it is her intention for that to happen. It is her intention for that to happen. So I personally prefer the term intention to the term will, but I'm quite sure we're talking about essentially the same thing. And if that is the case, then most certainly willing in the way I think you're speaking of it, I think it's central to trying to work with these kinds of transformations.
Right. Thank you, Mel, for coming in. Lee, we are entering now overtime. Are you happy to take one more question?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, great. I can see Andrew and Yuriko have their hand up. Is that right?
We do, yes. That was an absolutely wonderful presentation. I really appreciated it. It was just talking about the experiment at the end with the body, our body and the cloud. Brought to mind a wonderful quote from Jung when he was staying at Bollingen, and it resonates with my instinct to get away from this man-made environment as much as possible, this suffocating sort of environment of thought. And in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung's autobiography, he wrote when he was at Bollingen, which is his little lakeside tower he built with no electricity, no running water, absolutely rudimentary. And he wrote about staying there. At times I feel as if I'm spread out over the landscape and inside things, and am myself living in every tree, in the splashing of the waves, in the clouds and the animals that come and go, in the procession of the seasons. So it's not a question, I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Well,
Oh, wow.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. That is marvelous. And if we can come even slightly close to what he was describing there, I think we're making David Bohm very happy.
Yes, thank you, Andrew and Yuriko. It's great to see you here. Lee, I know there are loads of people who still want to ask questions, and I do apologize, but unfortunately it is towards the end of this session. Lee, would you like to just say something to close?
Well, mainly what I was mentioning at the end there, that I think it would be a very valuable and powerful thing for anybody that has interest in the kinds of things we're talking about today to look inwardly and outwardly and formulate experiments. You know, really push this and don't just be confined by what anybody says about it, but use it as a platform and test things and check them and push beyond what you're used to and have fun with it and experiment. And what could we do if many people were experimenting with this and sharing the results of that? That could be a very interesting thing. So whether we have that shared forum or not, that's what I would leave people with is be original, really be an original human being. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lee. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your final words, and thank you so much for being part of our series. And thank you for all you, the audience. Thank you for being here. Again, I do apologize for everyone who wanted to contribute but couldn't. Yeah, but unfortunately I do have to close. Now, just before we go, I would like to make a couple of announcements. First of all, I'd like to invite you all to next week's sessions. On Saturday, we have a session with our good friend Dave Schrum, who will give a talk entitled Beyond the Known Dimension, a journey into David Bohm's implicate order. And on Sunday, we will have Jan Wanniczek, which I can see he has joined us today, where he will talk about non-locality, interconnectedness, and the quantum observer. These two are the last official sessions of the series, so I welcome everyone to join us to finish. Again, I will announce this again for everyone who wasn't here yesterday with us, but I say official because us, together with Beth Macy, have organized a very special event to close this series. We've covered the past with this series. We went through Bohm's life, we've been through his work, we've been through his ideas, but now we would like to conclude the summer school by looking into the future. On Sunday, September 6th, we will have a closing session entitled Moving Forward with David Bohm, made up of a panel with some of the presenters who have been here with this series. The confirmed panelists for now are Leroy Littlebear, Lee Nichol, who was here with us today, Shantina Savadini, and Dave Schrum, all facilitated by Beth Macy. This session is free to anyone who has been part of our series. So, I mean, I'm personally very excited about this, so I really encourage everyone to come and join us for this. Also, I would like to remind everyone to keep using the Sutra discussion forum. I can see it's being quite active this week as well, so I really like to invite everyone to keep going with that. For people who don't know, Sutra is our online discussion forum. So it's a good platform for everyone to come together and keep the discussion going from these sessions, ask questions. I know some of our speakers are part of the Sutra platform, so that is also your opportunity to ask them questions directly. So yeah. Keep at it with that Sutra. If you have any questions at all, whether it's regarding the series, whether it's about Sutra or anything else about the Pari Center, do contact us. We do have a contact us section on our website. Otherwise, you can just send us an email straight to us to either james@paricenter.com, which is an email address, my email address, or eleanor@paricenter.com. Thank you all for joining us again, and we'll see you again soon here at the Pari Center.